Chapter 75 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 75. Effecting the Surround. The ride was rough and rapid, notwithstanding the superiority of my steed. It was as much as I could do to keep pace with my new allies, whose horses, used to all sorts of ground, went gliding along the uneven paths, as if they had been graded roads. Through tangled bushes they scrambled without stay, over sharp and slippery rocks, their unshod hoofs rendering them sure-footed as mountain sheep. Down the gorge lay our route, and paths, over which I had almost feared to walk my horse, were now passed in a quick continuous gallop. We soon reached the scene of my encounter with the huntress. The dog still kept sentry over the game, couchant by the body of the bighorn. He only growled as the cavalcade swept past. No one stopped to relieve him of his charge. On a war expedition the chase is universally neglected. Even its spoils are spurned. Hunger is supposed to beget prowess, as it sharpens the wits, and the savage fights best upon an empty stomach. The hurried movements of the Indians, the eagerness which one exhibited to press forward, proved how earnest they were on this expedition. It was not my affair that was stimulating them to such speed. A tribal hostility of long standing, older than the warriors themselves, existed between Utah and Arapaho. Between the bands of Wakara and Red Hand the hostile inheritance had increased until it had reached the maximum of the most deadly vendetta. This will account for the hot haste with which we hurried on, for the universal excitement that prevailed in the ranks of my Utah allies. They knew that they outnumbered their enemies. They already exulted in the anticipation of a grand coup. For all that, they were not rushing recklessly into battle. The Utah chieftain was too skilled a soldier. I perceived that he was acting upon a preconceived plan, and his strategy was soon made known to me. It was that of the surround. The band was to break up into 4 divisions of nearly equal numerical strength. The first, under Wakara himself, was to go round by the bluffs, and, having worked its way into the lower cañon, would enter the plain from that direction. Should the Arapahoes attempt to retreat towards the Arkansas, this party could intercept them. A second division, also keeping above the bluffs, was to make to a point nearly opposite the butte, where, by a ravine known to the Indians, a descent could be made into the valley of the Rufano. A third was to seek its station upon the opposite side, where a similar defile led down to the plain, while the remaining warriors were to move forward by the upper cañon, and halt at its mouth, until the other 3 parties were known to have reached their respective places. At a signal agreed upon, all 4 divisions were to move forward at a rapid gallop, and close in upon the enemy. The first party was to give the cue, as it had furthest to go, and, by the time it could reach its destination, the others would be ready. A smoke was to be the signal for charging forward. The plan was well conceived, and if it should prove that the Arapahoes were still by the butte, a fight à l'outrance might be looked for as the certain result. They would have no alternative but fight. The execution of the movement was soon entered upon. Near the place where I had passed the last hours of the night, a side ravine, which, in the darkness I had not observed, sloped up out of the gorge. By cañons and deep defiles the whole face of the country was cut up in this bipinnate fashion, every pass of it being well known to the Utahs. Hence their confidence in being able to effect the surround of their enemies, who were less familiar with this region, and who must have been tempted thither by the passage of the train. Up the lateral ravine rode Wakara with his dusky warriors, while the second division, intended to take more station on the bluff, defiled by the same track, but more slowly. The rest of us kept on down the gorge. On reaching the main cañon, the party destined for the opposite bluff separated from the other, and proceeded circuitously by a branch ravine that opened to the upper plain. The fourth and last division rode direct down the bank of the river, upon the path by which I had been pursued. This division was in charge of the second chief, and to it was I myself assigned, with Peg-leg, also a volunteer, as my immediate companion. The trapper had himself some old scores to settle with the Arapahoes, and appeared as eager for the fight as any Utah in the tribe. Apprehensive of falling in with some straggling pursuers of the preceding night, we moved forward with caution. The sub-chief was an old warrior, whose scars and grizzled hair betokened experience of many a hostile encounter, and no doubt many a cunning stratagem. Scouts were sent in advance, and these, returning from time to time, signalled that the path was clear. Advancing in this fashion, we at length reached the embouchure of the canon, and halted within its gloomy shadow. As yet not an Arapaho had been seen, but, on climbing to a ledge of rocks, I had the satisfaction to perceive that these brigands were still by the butte. I saw not them, but their horses, the cavallada being almost in the position in which I had left it. From this it was evident that they had returned from the pursuit, had abandoned it altogether, and given their steeds to the grass. Only a few of the men were in sight, moving about among the fires that still burned upon the plain. But the strength of the cavallada told that the others were there, no doubt, concealed from our view by the interposed mass of the mound. I saw the wagon at its base, the white tilt conspicuous against the dark green foliage of the cedars. But my eyes dwelt not upon this. In rapid glance, they were carried to the summit. The crucifix was still there. I could trace its timbers, its upright and horizontal beams, though not distinctly. I knew what was rendering their outlines indistinct. There was a body upon the cross, the body of a man. It was that which interrupted the regularity of the lines. The timbers were between me and the body, for I viewed it from behind, and at such a distance, I could not have told who was the crucified man, even had he been facing me. Wingrove or Sure Shot, one or the other. Of that much I was certain. I could make out that the man was naked, just as I had been myself. I saw his white skin glistening along each side of the upright post. While gazing upon it, I heard the report of a musket. Nearly at the same instant, a little blue-coloured cloud was ascending into the air. It rose from behind the butte, and was easily recognizable as smoke produced by the discharge of a gun. The savages had returned to their cruel sport. Too clearly did I comprehend the signs of that fiendish expedition. After regarding the crucifix for a while, I noted a circumstance that enabled me to decide which of my comrades was undergoing the terrible ordeal. To a certainty, Sure Shot was the sufferer. The Red Hand had fulfilled his threat, and my brave preserver was now promoted to my place. The circumstance that guided me to this knowledge was sufficiently definite. I could tell it was Sure Shot by his height. I remembered that my own crown scarcely reached the top of the upright post. That of him now enduring the torture rose above it. By the head, under the bright sunbeam, there was a sheen of yellow hair. That of Wingrove would have appeared dark. Beyond doubt, Sure Shot was the martyr now mounted upon that dread cross. I viewed the spectacle with feelings not to be envied. My soul chafed at the restraint, as it burned with bitter indignation against these demons in human form. I should have rushed forward to stay the sacrifice, or, if too late, to satisfy the vengeance it called forth. But I was restrained by reflecting on the impotency of the act. The prudent chief who commanded the Indians would not move till the smoke signal should be given, and videttes had climbed far up on the cliff to watch for and announce it. It was not anticipated that we should have long to wait. Our party had moved slowly down the defile, and the time consumed in our advance was considerable, almost enough to have enabled the others to get to their respective stations. This thought, along with my experience of the ball practice of the Arapahoes, in some measure reconciled me to the delay. If he upon the cross was still living, his chances of escape were scarcely problematical. Another shot or two from such marksmen would be neither here nor there, if the unfortunate man were already dead. Then was the delay of less consequence. We should still be in time to avenge him. But he was not dead. The evidence that he was living was before my eyes, though, in the confusion of the moment, I had no sooner perceived it. Above the top of the post appeared the head held stiffly upright. This proved that the body still lived. Had it been otherwise, the head would have been drooping. End of chapter 75. Chapter 76 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 76. The History of the Huntress. I had just made these observations as the Mexican clambered up the rock, and took stand by my side. "Hijo de Dios!" exclaimed he, as his eyes fell upon the cross, La Crucifixion. "What a conception for savages! Mira," he continued, as another white cloud puffed out from behind the sloping side of the mound, and the report of a musket came booming up the valley. "Santissima! They are firing at the unfortunate!" "Yes," said I, "they are playing with one of my comrades, as they did yesterday with myself. Ah, mio amigo, that is an old game of the Arapahoes. They used to practice it with their arrows, and for mere sport. Now that they have taken to guns, I suppose they combine instruction with amusement, as the books say. Carrambo, what cruel brutes they are! They have no more humanity than a grizzly bear. God help the poor wretch that falls into their clutches! Their captive women they treat with a barbarity unknown among other tribes. Even beauty, that would soften a savage of any other sort, is not regarded by these brutal Arapahoes. Only think of it! They were about to treat in this very fashion the beautiful Americana, the only difference being that they had strapped her to a tree instead of a crucifix. Carrai! The beautiful Americana? Yes, she who brought you to the camp. What? She in the hands of the Arapahoes? Sin duda. It was from them she was taken. When, and where, how, and by whom? Hola, hombre. 4 questions at once? Muy bien. I can answer them, if you give me time. To the first, I should say about 6 months ago. To the second, near the Big Timbers, on the Arkansas. My reply to the third will require more words, and before giving it, I shall answer the fourth by saying that the girl was taken from the Arapahoes by Don Jose. Don Jose? Who is Don Jose? Oh, perhaps you would know him by his American name. Weir? Walker, the celebrated trapper? Joe Walker? The same, amigo. Quora. The Utahs pronounce it. As you perceive, their young chief is named so, and after him. The trapper and he were sworn friends, brothers, or more like father and son, since Don Jose was much the older. Were friends. Are they not so still? Valga me Dios! No, that is no longer possible. Don Jose has gone under, was rubbed out more than 3 months ago, and by these very Arapahoes. That is why your fair campesana is now with the Utahs. The old trapper left her to his namesake, Quora, under whose protection she has been ever since. He has been true to his trust? He has protected her? Under the influence of singular emotions did these questions escape me. "Seguramente, amigo," replied the Mexican, with an ingenuousness calculated to allay my unpleasant fancies. "The Utah chief is a noble fellow, un hombre de bien. Besides, he would have done anything for his old friend, whose death greatly grieved him. That is just why you see him here in such haste. It was not to avenge your wrongs that they danced their war measure, but the death of Don Jose. All the same to you, however, since your companeros are likely to have the advantage of it. As for the Americana," continued he, before I had time to make rejoinder, "Virgin Santissima! Such a maiden was never seen in these parts. Such a shot! Not a marksman in the mountains could match with her, except Don Jose himself, who taught her. And as for hunting, la linda cazadora! She can steal upon the game like a cougar. Ah, she can protect herself. She has done so. But for her spirit and rifle, the Red Hand would have ruined her. But how? You have not told me." "True, cavallero. I have yet to answer number 3. Bueno, as I said, it was near the Big Timbers, where she got into the hands of the Arapahoes. There only a small band of the robbers, with Red Hand at their head. He wanted to play the brute with her. She kept him off with her rifle, and a big dog you have seen. Red Hand became angry, and had her strapped to a tree, where the monsters threatened to shoot their arrows into her body. Whether they intended to kill her, or only to terrify the poor girl, is not known. But if the former was their design, they were hindered from putting it into execution. Just at that moment Don Jose came upon the ground with a party of trappers from the rendezvous on Cerno Verde. They were strong enough to beat off the red-skinned ravishers and save the Americana. That is how she was taken from the Rapahoes. A brave deed! But how did she chance to be there, since Bint's Port was abandoned? There is no white settlement near the Big Timbers." "Ah, senor, that is the strangest part of the whole story. It was told me by Don Jose himself, while we were companeros on a trapping expedition, just after he had saved the girl. Carrambo! A strange tale. Have you any objection to tell it to me? I feel a singular interest in this young girl." "Sin duda. Of many a mountain man, the same might be said, and many an Indian too. Cavallero, you would not be flesh and blood, if you didn't." "Not that, I assure you. My interest in her springs from a different source. I have other reasons for inquiring into her history." "You shall have it, then, cavallero. At least so much as I know of it myself, for it is reasonable to suppose that Don Jose did not tell me all he knew. This much: the Niña was with a caravan that had come from one of your western states. It was a caravan of Mormons. You have heard of the Mormons, I suppose, those hereticos who have made settlements here beyond?" "I have." "Well, one of these Mormons was the husband of the girl, or rather ought to have been, since they were married just at starting. It appears that the young woman was against the marriage, for she loved someone more to her choice, but her father had forced her to it, and some quarrel happening just at the time with the favorite lover, she had consented, from pique, sin duda, to accept the Mormon." "She did accept him?" "Yes. But now comes the strange part of the story. All I have told you is but a common tale, and the like occurs every day in the year." "Go on." "When she married the Mormon, she did not know he was a Mormon, and it appears that these hereticos have a name among your people worse than the very Judios. It was only after the caravan had got out into the plains that the girl made this discovery. Another circumstance equally unpleasant soon came to her knowledge, and that was, that the man who pretended to be her husband was after all no husband, that he did not act to her as a husband should do, in short, that the marriage had been a sham, the ceremony having been performed by some Mormon brother in the disguise of a clerico." "Was the girl's father aware of this deception?" "Don Jose could not tell. He may have known that the man was a Mormon, but Don Jose was of opinion that the father himself was betrayed by the false marriage, though he was present at it, and actually bestowed the bride." "Strange." "Perhaps, cavallero. The strangest is yet to come. For what purpose, do you suppose, was this deception practised upon the poor girl?" "I cannot guess. Go on." "Caray, it was a hellish purpose. But you shall hear it. These Mormons have at their head a great chief priest, una profeta, as they call him. He is a polygamist, a perfect Turco, and keeps a harem of beautiful niñas, who pass under the name of spiritual wives. It was only after the young Americana had got far out upon the plains, indeed, to the Big Timbers, where she escaped from him, that she found out the terrible fate for which her false husband had designed her. She learnt it from the other women who accompanied the caravan, and who, base wretches that they were, rather envied her the honour by which she was to be distinguished. Por Dios, a terrible fate for a young creature innocent and virtuous like her." "Her fate? Quick, tell me. For what had the villain destined her?" "Virgin Santa, for the harem of the Mormon prophet. Mira, exclaimed the Mexican, almost in the same breath. "Mira, the signal smoke of Ocara! To horse! To horse! Miran los Arapahoes!" It was not the signal that called from my lips a convulsive exclamation. It was wrung from my agony. Ere the smoke had been descried, it was drowned amidst the shouts of the savage warriors, as they crowded forward out of the chasm. Leaping down from the ledge, and flinging myself on the back of my horse, I mingled in the mêlée. As we swept from the gorge, I cast a glance behind. The sound of female voices caused me to look back. The Utah women, mounted on mules and horses, were coming down the canyon, with the white Huntress at their head. I wished a word with her, but it was too late. I dared neither pause nor go back. My Utah allies would have branded me as a coward, a traitor to my own cause. I did not hesitate a moment, but, joining in the ugh-aloo, I dashed into the midst of the dusky host, and galloped onward to the charge. End of chapter 76.
Chapter 77 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 77. The Surprise. The white cloud, a puff of powder smoke, had scarcely scattered in the air when a dark mass appeared upon the plain, emerging from the sulphureous vapor. It was a troop of horsemen, the warriors of Ocara. On giving the signal, they had issued forth from the lower canyon, and were coming up the valley at a gallop. They were too distant for us to hear their charging cheer, but from right and left proceeded a double shout, a war cry answering to our own, and the moment after a stream of dusky forms was seen pouring down each bluff through the sloping gorges that led to the plain. We could hear the shout that announced the astonishment of the Arapahoes. It betokened more than astonishment. There was terror in its wild intonations. It was evident that they had been taken altogether by surprise, having no suspicion that an enemy was near, least of all the dreaded foes who were now rushing forward to surround them. The red men are rarely betrayed into a panic. Accustomed from earliest youth to war, with all its wiles, they are always prepared for a stampede. It is the system they themselves follow, and are ever expecting to be practiced against them. They accept the chances of attack, no matter how sudden or unforeseen, with all the coolness of a contest premeditated and prearranged. Even terror does not create confusion in their ranks, for there are no ranks, and in conflicts with their own race, combinations that result from drill and discipline are of little consequence. It is usually a fight hand to hand and man to man, where individual prowess prevails and where superior personal strength and dexterity conduct to conquest. It is for this reason that the scalp trophy is so highly prized. It is a proof that he who has taken it must have fought to obtain it. When hair is raised in a night attack by the chance of an arrow or a bullet, it is less esteemed. By the laws of Indian warfare, the stratagem of assassination is permissible and practiced without stint. But a coup of this kind is far less glorious than to slay an enemy in the open field and under the broad glare of the sunlight. In conflicts by day, strategy is of slight advantage, and superior numbers are alone dreaded. It was the superior numbers of the Utah enemies that caused dismay in the ranks of the Arapahoes. Otherwise, they would not have regarded the mode of attack, whether their assailants advanced upon them in a single body or in 4 divisions, as they were doing. Indeed, it was merely with a view of cutting off their retreat that the Utah chieftain had adopted the plan. Had he not taken the precaution to approach from all sides at once, it would have been necessary for him to have waited for the night before an attack could have been made. In daylight, it would have been impossible to get even within shot range of the enemy. The Arapahoes were as well mounted as the Utahs, and perceiving their inferiority in numbers, they would have refused to fight and ridden off, perhaps without losing a man. The strategic maneuver of the Utah was meant to force the Red Hand to a conflict. This was its purpose and no other. It was likely to be successful. For the Arapahoes there appeared no alternative but stand and fight. The attack coming from 4 points at one and the same time, and by superior numbers, must have caused them fear. How could it be otherwise? It failed, however, to create any remarkable confusion. We could see them hurrying around the butte in the direction of their caballada, and in an incredibly short space of time most of the warriors had leaped to their horses, and with their long spears towering high above their heads, had thrown themselves into an irregular formation. The plain at this moment presented an animated spectacle. He upon the summit of the butte, if still alive, must have viewed it with singular emotions. The painted Arapahoes clustered around their chief, and for the moment appearing in a close crowd, silent and immobile, from north, south, east, and west, the 4 bands of the Utahs approaching in rapid gallop, each led by its war chief, while the ugh-aloo, pealing from 500 throats, reverberated from cliff to cliff, filling the valley with its vengeful echoes. The charge might have been likened to a chapter from the antique, an onslaught of Scythians. Would the Arapahoes await the shock of all 4 divisions at once? All were about equally distant, and closing in at equal speed. Surely the Red Hand would not stay to be thus attacked. "Carambo! I wonder they're not off before this," shouted Archilete, who was galloping by my side. "Ha! Yonder," added he, "a party on foot making from the grove of alamos. They are waiting for those to come up. That's what's been detaining them. Mira." As the Mexican spoke, he pointed to a small tope of cottonwoods, which grew isolated about 300 or 400 yards from the mound. Out of this was seen issuing some 15 or 20 Arapahoes. They were on foot, except 3 or 4 who appeared to be carried by the others. "They're wounded," continued the trapper. "They've had them under the bushes to keep the sun off them, I suppose. Mira! They're meeting them with horses. They mean flight, then." A party with led horses were seen galloping out from the base of the butte, evidently to take up the men on foot, who were still hurrying towards their mounted comrades, as fast as the nature of their duty would permit them. There were several groups of the Indians on foot, each no doubt in charge of a disabled comrade. One crowd appeared to encircle a man who was not borne upon their shoulders, but was moving forward on his own feet. The violent gesticulations of those who surrounded him drew our attention. The man was evidently being menaced and urged forward, as if he went against his will. "Caray!" exclaimed the Mexican. "He is not one of their wounded. A captive! One of your camarados, I dare say." "No doubt of it," I replied at that moment, equally guided to the conjecture. "Wah!" exclaimed the trapper, "the poor fellow's scalp is in danger just now. I wonder they take all that trouble to get him away alive. That puzzles me, amigo. I think it high time they looked to their own lives without being so particular about that of their prisoner. Santissima Virgin! As I live, there's a woman among them." "Yes, I see her. I know her. Her presence explains why they're taking him alive." "You know her?" "And him, too. Poor fellow, I hope she will befriend him, but—" I was hindered from continuing the explanation. Just at that moment the led horses were rushed up to, and those in charge of the wounded were seen to spring to their backs. Here and there a double mount proclaimed that the disabled men were still capable of making a last effort for their lives. All had got upon their horses, and in a straggling crowd were making to join the main band, when just at that moment one of the horses that carried two men was seen to swerve suddenly from the line, and heading up the valley came galloping in our direction. The horse appeared to have taken fright and shied away from the others, while the men upon his back were tossing and writhing about, as if trying to restrain him. At the same instant half a dozen mounted Arapahoes were seen shooting forth from the crowd, and with loud yells galloping in pursuit of the runaway. The double-loaded steed, a powerful animal, kept on his course, but not until he had approached within 300 or 400 paces of our own front. Could I account for this strange maneuver? Then was I enabled to comprehend the mysterious escapade. The rider upon the croup was Frank Wingrove. He upon the saddle was a red Arapaho. The bodies of the two men appeared to be lashed together by a rawhide rope, but in front of the Indian I could perceive the muscular arms of the young backwoodsman tightly embracing the chest of the savage, while with the reins in his fingers he was guiding the gallop of the horse. With a shout of joy I hailed the escape of my comrade, now no longer problematical. In a score of seconds more we should meet. The pursuers, satisfied that his recapture was hopeless without risking their own scalps, had already turned with a despairing shout and were galloping back. Wingrove was near enough to hear the cry of encouragement that passed from my lips, and soon recognizing me, despite the disguise of the serape, headed his horse directly towards us. "Hurrah, cap'n!" cried he, as he came up. "Have you e'er a knife to cut me clar o' this Injun? Durn the nigger, I've got him in a leetle o' the tightest fix he's been in for a while, I reckon. Dog gone ye! Keep still, ye skunk, or I'll smash every rib in your body. Quiet now!" During all this time the Indian was making the most strenuous efforts to free himself from the grasp of his powerful adversary, now endeavouring to throw himself down from the horse, anon trying to turn the animal in an opposite direction. But the thongs intended to secure his captive, and which had no doubt been wound around both of them by a third hand, had become bonds for himself. Wingrove, who had by some means wrenched his wrists free from their fastenings, had turned the tables upon his captor by transforming him into a captive. I chanced to be without a knife, but the Mexican was supplied with the necessary implement, and drawing it from its sheath, shot past me to use it. I thought he intended to cut the thongs that bound the two men together. So did he, but not till after he had performed another operation, which consisted in plunging his blade between the ribs of the Arapaho. At the stab the Indian gave utterance to his wild death shout. In the same instant his head coggled over upon his shoulder, his body relaxed its muscular tension, and hung limp over the rawhide rope. A snig of the red blade severed the thong, and the Indian's body, sliding down from the withers of the horse, fell with a dull dead sound upon the turf. "Here, Americano!" cried the trapper, holding out the ensanguined knife to Wingrove. "Take this weapon, for want of a better. Let us on. See, the picaros are making off. Vamos, nos vamonos." The incident had delayed us but for a very short while, perhaps not half a minute, but as we returned to the charging gallop, most of our party had passed us, and the foremost were already within rifle range and opening fire upon the Arapahoes. End of chapter 77. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 78 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 78. The Charge. The horsemen, who had forged ahead for a while, hindered me from seeing the enemy. The Utahs had halted and were discharging their guns. The smoke from their shots shrouded both allies and enemies, but from the fact of a halt having been made, I presumed the Arapahoes were making stand by the butte. It was not so. After the first round of shots, the firing ceased, and the Utahs again went charging onward. The Arapahoes had given way, and were fleeing down the valley. There they must meet Wa-ka-ra, and this, or something like it, was their intention. With the four divisions closing upon them from all sides at once, they saw there was no chance of saving themselves except by making a desperate charge on some one singly, in the hope of causing it to yield, and thus open for them a way to escape. They had no difficulty in making choice of which they should meet. The band of Wa-ka-ra was between them and their own country. It was the direction in which they must ultimately retreat, and this decided to take them down the valley. A slight swell in the plain, which we were at that moment crossing, gave me a view of the retreating Arapahoes. In the distance I could see the band of Wa-ka-ra advancing toward them at full speed. In a few seconds would meet in shivering charge these mortal foes. The Utahs of our party were urging their horses to utmost speed. Well mounted as were myself and companions, we were unable to overtake them. Those that came from right and left had suddenly swerved from their course, and in two converging lines were sweeping down the valley to the assistance of their chief. We passed close under the edge of the butte. In the excitement of the chase, I had almost forgotten to look up, when a shrill shout recalled in my memory the captive on the cross. The cry came from the summit. The sure shot himself. Thank heaven, he lived! "Huzza! Huzzay!" shouted the voice. "Heaving speed, yees, whosever ye be! Huzza! Huzzay! Arter them vermin, and gie me 'em goss! Sculp every mother's son of 'em! Huzza! Hooray!" There was no time to make reply to these cries of encouragement. Enough to know that it was our old comrade who gave utterance to them. It proved he was still living, and echoing his exulting shout, we galloped onward. It was a fearful sight to behold the two dark bands as they dashed forward upon one another, like opposing waves of an angry ocean. Through the horsemen in front of me, I could see the meeting and hear the shock. It was accompanied by wild yells. by voices heard in loud taunting tones, by the rattling of shields, the crashing collision of spear shafts, and the sharp detonations of rifles. The band of Wa ka ra recoiled for a moment. It was by far the weakest, and had it been left to itself, would have sustained defeat in this terrible encounter. But the Utahs were armed both with rifles and pistols, and the latter, playing upon the ranks of the Arapahoes, were fast thinning them. Dusky warriors were seen dropping from their horses, while the terrified animals were galloping over the field, their wild neighs adding to the uproar of the fight. There was but one charge, a short but terrible conflict, and then the fight was over. It became transformed, almost in an instant, to a disorderly flight. When the hot scurry had ended, the remnant of the prairie horsemen was seen heading down the valley, followed by the 4 bands of the Utahs, who had now closed together. Pressing onward in the pursuit, they still vociferated their wild halloo, firing shots at intervals as they rode within reach of their flying foemen. Neither Wingrove nor I had an opportunity of taking part in the affray. It was over before we could ride up, and indeed, had it been otherwise, neither of us could have been of much service to our allies. Painted as both were, and in full war costume, in other words, naked to the breech clout, we could not have distinguished friends from foes. It was partly this consideration that had occasioned us to halt. We drew up on the ground where the collision had occurred with the band of Wa ka ra. We looked upon a spectacle that might at any other time have horrified us. 100 bodies lay over the sward, all dead. There were Utahs as well as Arapahoes, but, though we could not distinguish the warriors of the 2 tribes in the confusion of the fight, there was no difficulty in identifying their dead. There was a signal difference in the aspect of the slain Indians. Around the skulls of the Utahs the thick black tresses were still clustering, while upon the heads of the Arapahoes there was neither hair nor skin. Every one of them had been already scalped. Wounded men were sitting up or propped against dead bodies, each with 2 or 3 comrades bending over him. Horses were galloping around, their lazos trailing at will, while weapons of every kind, spears, shields, bows, quivers, and arrows, were strewn upon the sward. A group of about a dozen men appeared at some distance, clustered around a particular object. It was the dead body of a man, a chief, no doubt. Not without feelings of apprehension did I approach the spot. It might be the noble Wa ka ra. I rode up and looked over the shoulders of those who encircled the corpse. A glance was sufficient to put an end to my apprehensions. The body was covered with blood, and pierced with many wounds. It was frightfully mutilated, but I was able to identify the features as those of Red Hand, the chief of the Arapahoes. Scarred and gashed though it was, I could still trace those sinister lines that in life had rendered that face so terrible to behold. It was even more hideous in death, but the Utahs who stood around no longer regarded it with fear. The terror which their dread foeman had oft inspired within them was now being retaliated in the mockery of his mutilated remains. The Mexican had ascertained that Wa ka ra was still unhurt, and heading the pursuit. Having myself no further interest in the scene, I turned away from it, and, with Wingrove by my side, rode back toward the butte. Chapter 78. Chapter 79 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 79. Tragic and Comic. Some words passed between us as we went. For my companion, I had news that would make him supremely happy. Our conversation turned not on that. Soon enough, thought I, when they shall come together, let both hearts be blessed at the same time. Ah! how my own was bleeding! Little suspected the Spanish hunter how his tale had tormented me. Wingrove, in brief detail, gave me the particulars of his escape. Like myself, he had been captured without receiving any serious injury. They would have killed him afterwards, but for the interference of the Chickasaw, who, by some means, had gained an ascendancy over the Red Hand. In the breast of that desperate woman burned alternately the passions of love and revenge. The former had been for the time in the ascendant, but she had saved the captive's life only in the hope of making him her captive. She had carried him to the copse, where he had passed the night in her company. One moment caressed and entreated, in the next reviled and menaced with the most cruel death. In vain had he looked for an opportunity to get away from her. Like a jealous tigress, she had watched him throughout the livelong night, and it was only in the confusion created by our sudden approach that he had found a chance to escape from the double guardianship in which he had been held. All this was made known to me in a few hurried phrases. Sure shot, we were within speaking distance, but who could have identified the Yankee in such a guise? The tricoloured escutcheon I had myself so lately borne, the black face, shoulders, and arms, the white circle on the breast, the red spot, all just as they had painted me. "Jehoshaphat and pigeon pie!" he cried as he saw us approach. "Air it you, capting? And Wingrove too?" "Yes, brave comrade. Your shot has saved us all. Patience! We shall soon set you free." Leaping down from our horses, we hurried up the sloping path. I was still anxious about Sure shot's safety; but in another moment my anxiety was at an end. He was yet unscathed. Like myself, he had received some scratches, but no wound of a dangerous character. Like myself, he had died 100 deaths, and yet lived. His gleesome spirit had sustained him throughout the dread ordeal. He had even joked with his cruel tormentors. Now that the dark hour was past, his jets d'esprit were poured forth with a continuous volubility. No, not continuous. At intervals a shadow crossed his spirit, as it did that of all of us. We could not fail to lament the fate of the unfortunate Hibernian. "Poor Patrick!" said Sure shot, as we descended the slope. "He were the joyfullest kimrade I ever had, and we must gie him a barrel o' a Christian. I wonder now what on airth them verming lies done wi' him. Where can they have hid his body? True, where is it? It was out yonder on the plain. I saw it there. They had scalped him. Yees, they scalped him. At the time we were all captured, he were lying just out there last night at sundown. He ain't there now, nor ain't a been this morning, or I'd a seen him. What do yees think they done with him, anyhow?" The disappearance of the body was singular enough. It had undoubtedly been removed from the spot where it had lain, and was now nowhere to be seen. It was scarcely probable that the wolves had eaten it, for the Indians had been all night upon the ground, and their camp fires were near. True, the coyotes would have cared little for that, but surely the brutes could not have carried the body clear away. The bones, at least, would have remained. There were none, not a trace either of body or bones. We passed around the butte, and made search on the other side. There was no dead body there, no remains of one. Ha! The river! It swept past within 50 yards of the mound. It would account for the disappearance of the corpse. Had the Indians thrown it into the water? We walked toward the stream half mechanically. We had little expectation of finding the remains of the unfortunate man. The current rushed rapidly on. The body would have been taken along with it. "Maybe it mout have lodged somewheres," suggested Sure Shot. "If we should find it, capting, I'd like to put a sod over him, for old time's sake. Shall we try down the stream?" We followed the bank downward. A little below grew willows, forming a selvedge to the river's edge, their culms carved over till the long quivering leaves dipped into the water. Here and there were thickets of them extending back into the plain. Only by passing through these could the bank of the river be reached. We entered among the willows, Wingrove going in the advance. I saw him stoop suddenly, as if to examine the ground. An exclamation escaped him, and the words, "Somebody's been through hyar, or been dragged through, one of the two ways. No," added he, after a moment, "he's not been dragged. He's been creeping on his hands and knees. Look thar! The track of a knee, as clar as daylight; and, by the tarnal, it's been covered wi' broadcloth. No Injun could a made that mark." We all bent over to examine the sign. Sure enough, it was the track of a man's knee; and the plastic mud exhibited on its surface a print of fretted lines, which must have been made by coarse threadbare cloth. "By gosh!" exclaimed Sure Shot, "that ere's the infantry overall the giver'ment cloth to a sartinty. Patrick's been about here. Lordy! 'tain't possible he's livin'." "Sure Shot! Sure Shot! Mother of Moses! is it yourself I hear?" The voice reached us in a hoarse whisper. It appeared to rise out of the earth. For some moments we all stood, as if petrified by surprise. "Sure Shot!" continued the voice, "won't yez help me out? I'm too weak to get up the bank. Petrick, as I'm a livin' sinner! Good Lordy, Petrick, where air ye? 'Tain't possible you're alive?" "Och! an' sure I'm aloive, that same; but I'm more than half did, for all that, and nearly drownded to boot. Arrah, boys! ratch me a hand, an' pull me out, for I can't move myself. One of my legs is broke." We all three rushed down to the water, whence the voice appeared to come. Under the drooping willows, where the current had undermined the bank, we perceived an object in motion. A fearful object it was to look upon. It was the encrimsoned skull of our scalped comrade. His body was submerged below the surface. His head alone was visible. A horrid sight! The three of us leaped at once into the stream, and raising the poor fellow in our arms, lifted him out on the bank. It was as he had alleged. One of his legs was broken below the knee, and other frightful wounds appeared in different parts of his body. No wonder the Indians had believed him dead when they stripped off that terrible trophy. Notwithstanding the ill usage he had received, there was still hope. His wounds, though ugly to the eye, were none of them mortal. With care he might recover, and taking him up as tenderly as possible, we conveyed him back to the butte. The Arapahoes had left their impedimenta behind them, blankets and robes at discretion. With these, a soft couch was prepared under the shade of the waggon body, and the wounded man placed upon it. Such rude dressing as we were able to give was at once administered to his wounds, and we found new joy in the anticipation of his recovery. His disappearance from the spot where he had been left for dead was explained. He had played possum, as he himself expressed it. Though roughly handled and actually senseless for a time, he had still clung to life. He knew that the Indians believed him dead, else why should they have scalped him? With a faint hope of being left upon the field, he had lain still, without stirring hand or foot, and the savages, otherwise occupied, had not noticed him after taking his scalp. By some accident his hands had got over his face, and perceiving that these screened his countenance from observation, he had permitted them to remain so. With half opened eyes he could see between his fingers, and note many of the movements that were passing upon the plain in front of him. All this without the Indians having the slightest suspicion that he lived. It was a terrible time for him, an ordeal equal to that endured by Sure Shot and myself. Every now and then some half drunken savage would come staggering past, and he knew not how soon some one of these strollers might stick a spear into him, out of mere wantonness. On the arrival of night his hopes had revived, and the cool air had also the effect of partially restoring his strength. The savages, carousing around their fires, took no notice of him, and as soon as darkness was fairly down, he had commenced crawling off in the direction of the river. He had a double object in going thither. He was suffering from horrid thirst, and he hoped there to find relief, as well as a hiding place. After crawling for more than an hour, he had succeeded in reaching the bank, and taking to the water, he had waded down, and concealed himself under the willows, in the place where we had found him. Such was the adventure of the ci devant soldier, Patrick O'Tigg, an escape almost miraculous. As if fulfilling the laws of dramatic justice, that the farce should succeed the tragedy, our attention was at this moment called to a ludicrous incident. The Mexican trapper had ridden up, and halted beside the waggon, when all at once his eyes became fixed upon an object that lay near at hand upon the grass. It was the black silk hat of the ex-rifleman, already mentioned in our narrative. After gazing at it for a moment, the Mexican slid down from his horse, and hobbling toward the hat, took it up. Then uttering a fierce "Carajo!" he dashed the tile back to the ground, and commenced stamping upon it, as if it had been some venomous serpent he desired to annihilate. "Hilloo theer, hombre!" shouted Sure Shot. "What the old scratch are ye about? Why, you yellow bellied fool, that's my hat you're stomping on!" "Your hat!" echoed the trapper in a contemptuous tone. "Carrambo, senor! You should be ashamed of yourself. Any man who would wear a silk hat. Ha! And why ain't a silk hat as good as any other?" "Maldito si!" continued the trapper, taking the wooden leg from his waist, and hammering the hat with it against a stone. "Maldito sombrero! But for the accursed invention, we poor trappers wouldn't be as we are now. Carrambo! It's fetched beaver down to a plew a plug, while only 10 years ago we could get 6 pesos the skin. Only think of that! Carrai!" Pronouncing this last exclamation with bitter aspirate, the incensed trapper gave the unfortunate hat one more blow with his timber leg, and then, burning the battered tile from his toe, hobbled back to his horse. Sure Shot was disposed to be angry, but a word set it all right. I perfectly comprehended the nature of the trapper's antipathy to silk hats, and explained it to my comrade. In their eyes, the absurd headgear is more hideous than even to those who are condemned to wear it, for the trappers well know that the introduction of the silk hat has been the ruin of their peculiar calling. "'Twa'n't much of a hat after all," said Sure Shot, reconciled by the explanation. "It belonged to the sutler at the fort; for you see, capting, as we left theer for a little bit of a hurry, I couldn't lay my claws on my own old forage cap, so I took the hat in its place, and that's how I kim by the thing. But here's a hat, perhaps, mister, this here'll please you better, will it, eh?" As Sure Shot put the question, he took up the plume bonnet of an Arapaho warrior, which had been left lying among the rocks, and, adjusting the gaudy circlet upon his head, strode backward and forward over the ground with all the swelling majesty of an Indian dandy. The odd looking individual and his actions caused the laughter of the bystanders to break forth in loud peals. The Mexican fairly screamed, interlarding his cachinnations with loud "Santissimas" and other exclamations, while the wounded man under the waggon was unable to restrain himself at the mirth provoking spectacle. Chapter 79. Chapter 80 of the Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 80. Spiritual Wives. I joined not in the merriment of my companions. I took no share in their mirth. The trapper's story had intensified the anguish of my thoughts, and now that I found time to dwell upon its purport, my reflections were bitter beyond expression. I could have no doubt as to who was the heroine of that strange story. She who had been so shamefully deceived, she who had so nobly risked her life to save her honour, she the wild huntress, by the Utahs called Marani, could be no other than that Marian of whom I had heard so much, Marian Holt. The circumstances detailed by the trapper were perfectly conformable to this belief. They concurred in establishing it. The time, the place, the route taken, the Mormon train, all agreed with what we had ascertained regarding Stephen's first expedition across the prairies. The Mexican had mentioned no names. It was likely he knew them not, or if so, it was scarcely probable he could have pronounced them. But it needed not names to confirm me in the belief that John Stebbins was the sham husband, and that she whom he would have betrayed, this Huntress maiden, was the lost love of my comrade Wingrove, the sister of my own Lilian. This would account for the resemblance that had struck me. It no longer seemed vague in my memory. I could now trace it palpably and clearly. And this was the grand beauty upon which the young backwoodsman had so enthusiastically descanted. Often had he described it to my incredulous ear. I had attributed his praises to the partiality of a lover's eye, having not the slightest suspicion that their object was possessed of such merits. No more should I question the justice of his admiration, nor wonder at its warmth. The rude hyperbole that had occasionally escaped him, when speaking of the girl, as he called her, no longer appeared extravagant. In truth, the charms of this magnificent maiden, worthy of metaphoric phrase. Perhaps had I seen her first, before looking upon Lilian, that is, had I not seen Lilian at all, my own heart might have yielded to this half Indian damsel. Not so now. The gaudy tulip may attract the eye, but the incense of the perfumed violet is sweeter to the soul. Even had both been presented together, I could not have hesitated in my choice. All the same, should I have chosen the gold and the rose, and my heart's preference was now fixed, fondly and forever. My love for Lilian Holt was a passion too profound to be otherwise than perpetual. It was in my bosom, in its innermost recesses, all pervading, all absorbing. There would it cling till death. Even in those dread hours, when death seemed hovering above my head, the thought of Lilian was uppermost. Even then did my mind dwell upon the perils that encompassed her path. And now that I was myself delivered from danger, had I reason to regard the future of my beloved with apprehensions less acute? No. The horrid scheme which the trapper's story had disclosed in respect to her sister, might not she too be the victim of a similar procuration? Oh heavens! It was too painfully probable. The more I dwelt upon it, the more probable appeared this appalling hypothesis. I have already spoken of my experience of Mormon life, and the insight I had incidentally obtained into its hideous characteristics. I have said that the spiritual wife doctrine was long since exploded, repudiated even by the apostles themselves, and in its place the many wife system had been adopted. There was no change in reality, only in profession. The practice of the Mormon leaders had been the same from the beginning, only that then polygamy had been carried on sub rosa. Felicity being no longer dreaded, it was now practised openly and above board. We termed it polygamy, adopting an Oriental phrase. It is nothing of the kind. Polygamy presupposes some species of marriage, according to the laws of the land. But for Mormon matrimony, at least that indulged in by the dignitaries of the church, there were no statutes except such as they had chosen to set up for themselves. The ceremony is simply a farce, and consists in the sprinkling of a little water by some brother apostle, with a few mock mesmeric passes, jocosely termed the laying on of hands. The cheat is usually a secret performance, having no other object than to overcome those natural scruples, not very strong among the women of Mormon training, but which sometimes, in the case of young girls of Christian education, had opposed themselves to the designs of these impudent impostors. Something resembling matrimony may be the condition of a Mormon wife, that is, the wife of an ordinary saint, whose means will not allow him to indulge in the gross joys of polygamy. But it is different with a score or two of well-to-do gentlemen who finger the finances of the church, the tenths and other tributes which they contrive to extract from the common herd. Among these, the so-called wife is regarded in no other light than that of une femme entretenue. I knew that one of the duties specially enjoined upon those emissaries termed apostles is to gather young girls from all parts of the world. The purpose is proclaimed with all the affectation of sanctified phraseology, that they should become mothers in the church, and by this means lead to the more rapid increase of the followers of the true faith. This is the public declaration intended for the common ear, but the leaders are actuated by motives still more infamous. Their emissaries have instructions to select the fairer forms of creation, and it is well known that to make converts of this class have their energies been more especially devoted. It was this species of proselytizing, alas, too often successful, that more than aught else had roused the indignation of the backwoodsmen of Missouri and Illinois, and caused the expulsion of the saints from their grand temple city of Nauvoo. In the ranks of their assailants were many outraged men, fathers who looked for a lost child, angry brothers seeking revenge for a sister lured from her home, lovers who lamented a sweetheart beguiled by that fatal faith, and no doubt the blood of the pseudo saints there and then shed was balm to many a chafed and sorrowing spirit. In the category of this uxorious infamy, no name was more distinguished than that of him on whose shoulders the mantle of the prophet had descended, the chief who now held ascendancy among these self-styled saints, and who, with an iron hand, controlled the destinies of their church. A man cunning and unscrupulous, a thorough plebeian in thought, but possessed of a certain portentous polish, well suited to deceive the stupid herd that follows him, and sufficient for the character he is called upon to play. A debauchee boldly declared, and scarcely caring for the hypocrisy of concealment. Above all, an irresponsible despot, whose will is law, to all around him, and, when needing enforcement, can at any hour pretend to the sanction of authority from heaven. Such is the head of the Mormon Church. With both the temporal and spiritual power in his hands, legislative, executive, and judicial united, the fiscal, too, for the prophet, is sole treasurer of the tenths. This monster of imposition wields a power equalled only by the barbaric chiefs of Africa, or the Rajahs of India. It might truly be said that both the souls and bodies of his subjects are his, and not their own. The former he can control, and shape to his designs at will. As for the latter, though he may not take life openly, it is well known that his sacred edict issued to the destroying angels is equally efficacious to kill. Woe betide the latter-day saint who dares to dream of dissent or apostasy. Woe to him who expresses disaffection or even discontent. Too surely may he dread a mysterious punishment, too certainly expect the midnight visitation of the Danites. Exercising such influence over Mormon men, it is almost superfluous to add that his control over Mormon women is yet more complete. Virtue, assailed under the mask of a spiritual hypocrisy, is apt to give way, alas, too easily. In all parts of the world, but in a state of society where such slips are rather a fashion than a disgrace, it is needless to say that they are of continual occurrence. The practice of the pseudo-prophet in wife-taking has very little limit beyond that fixed by his own desires. It is true he may not outrage certain formalities by openly appropriating the wives of his followers, but should he fancy to become the husband of their daughters, not only is there no opposition offered on the part of the parent, but the base proposal is regarded in the light of an honour. So esteemed it by the women from whom Marian Holt had run away, the brave girl preferring the perils of starvation and savage life to such gentle companionship, thus contemplating the character of the vulgar Alcibiades for whose harem she had been designed, in full knowledge of the circumstances which now surrounded her sister. How could I dream the situation of Lilian otherwise than similar, her destiny the same, with such a tyrant to betray, such a father to protect? No wonder that I trembled for her fate. No wonder that the sweat, forced from me by my soul's agony, broke out in bead drops upon my brow. End of chapter 80. Chapter 81 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 81. The Death Song. Prostrated in spirit, I sunk down among the rocks, covering my face with my hands. So occupied was I with wild imaginings that I saw not the Utah women as they passed down the valley. They did not approach the butte, nor make halt near, but hastened directly onward to the scene of conflict. I had for the moment forgotten them, and was only reminded of their proximity on hearing the death wail as it came pealing up the valley. It soon swelled into a prolonged and plaintive chorus, interrupted only by an occasional shriek that denoted the discovery of some relative among the slain, father, brother, husband, or perhaps still nearer and dearer, some worshipped lover who had fallen under the spears of the Arapahoes. Was Marian Lee among them? The wailing women? The thought aroused me from my reverie of wretchedness. A gleam of joy shot suddenly across my mind. It was the wild huntress that had given origin to the thought. On her I had founded a new hope. She must be seen. No time should be lost in communicating with her. Had she accompanied the women of the tribe? Was she upon the ground? I rose to my feet, and was going for my horse. I saw Wingrove advancing toward me. The old shadow had returned to his brow. I might exult in the knowledge of being able to dispel it once and forever. Fortunate fellow! Little suspected he, at that moment, how I held his happiness in my hand, how, with one word, I could raise from off his heart the load that for 6 long months had weighed heavily upon it. Yes, a pleasant task was before me. Though my own heart bled, I could stop the bleeding of his, of hers, both in a breath. Now, or not yet? I hesitated. I can scarcely tell why. Perhaps it was that I might enjoy a double delight by making the disclosure to both of them at once. I had a sweet surprise for them. To both, no doubt, it would be a revelation that would yield the most rapturous joy. Should I bring them face to face, and leave them to mutual explanations? This was the question that had offered itself, and caused me to hesitate and reflect. No, I could not thus sport with hearts that loved. I could not procrastinate that exquisite happiness, now so near. At once let them enter upon its enjoyment. But both could not be made happy exactly at the same instant. One or other must be first told the glad truth that was in store for them. Apart they must be told it, and to which was I to give the preference? I resolved to follow that rule of polite society which extends priority to the softer sex. Wingrove must wait. It was only with an effort I could restrain myself from giving him a hint of his proximate bliss. I was sustained in the effort, however, by observing the manner in which he approached me. Evidently he had some communication to make that concerned our future movements. Up to that moment there had been no time to talk, even to think of the future. "I've got something to say to you, captain," said he, drawing near, and speaking in a serious tone. "It's better, maybe, ye should know it afore we go further. The girl's been givin' me some particulars o' the caravan that I hain't told ye." "What girl?" "The Chickasaw, Saw Wanee." "Oh, true! What says she? Some pleasant news, I may anticipate, since she had been the bearer of them." It was not any lightness of heart that caused me to give an ironical form to the interrogative. Far from that. "Well, captain," replied my comrade, "it is rather ugly news the red-skinned devils told me, but I don't know how much truth there's in it, for I've found her out in more'n one lie about this business. She's been with the caravan, however, and she'd know all about it." "About what?" I asked. "Well, Su Wa Nee says that the caravan's broke up into two." "Ha! One half of it, with the dragoons, has turned south, towards Santa Fe. The other, which air all Mormons, have struck off north'ardly by a different pass, and on a trail that makes for their new settlement on Salt Lake." "Well, there's not much news in that. We had anticipated something of the kind." "But there's worse, captain." "Worse? What is it, Wingrove?" I put the question with a feeling of renewed anxiety. "Holt's gone with the Mormons." "That too I had expected. It does not surprise me in the least." "Ah, captain!" continued the backwoodsman with a sigh, while an expression of profound sadness pervaded his features, "there's uglier news still." "Ha!" I involuntarily exclaimed, as an evil suspicion crossed my mind. "News of her? Quick, tell me, has aught happened to her?" "The worst that could happen, I reckon. She's dead." I started, as if a shot had passed through my heart. Its convulsive throbbing stifled my speech. I could not get breath to utter a word, but stood gazing at my companion in silent agony. "Arter all," he continued in a tone of grave resignation, "I don't know if it air the worst. I sayed afore, and I say so still, that I'd ruther she wur dead than in the arms o' that stinkin' Mormon. Poor Marian! She had but a short life o't, and not a very merry one either." "What! Marian? Is it of her you were speaking?" "Why, sartin, captain. Who else should it be?" "Marian dead?" "Yes, poor girl, she never lived to see that Salt Lake City, where that cussed varmint wur takin' her. She died on the way out, and wur buried som'ers on the purayras. I wish I knew whar. I'd go to see her grave." "Ha, ha, ha! Whose story is this?" My companion looked at me in amazement. The laugh, at such a time, must have sounded strange to his ears. "The Injun heerd it from Lil," replied Wingrove, still puzzled at my behaviour. "Stebbins had told it to Holt, and to her likewise. Poor young critter! I reckon he'll be wantin' her too, now that he's lost the other. Poor little Lil!" "Cheer, comrade, cheer! Either Su Wa Nee or Stebbins has lied, belike both of them, since both had a purpose to serve: the Mormon to deceive the girl's father, the Indian to do the same with you. The story is false. Marian Holt is not dead." "Marian ain't dead?" "No, she lives. She has been true to you. Listen!" I could no longer keep from him the sweet secret. The reaction consequent on the bitter pang I had just experienced, while under the momentary belief that it was Lilian who was dead, had stirred my spirit, filling it with a wild joy. I longed to impart the same emotions to my suffering companion; and, in rapid detail, I ran over the events that had occurred since our parting. To the revelations which the Mexican had made, Wingrove listened with frantic delight, only interrupting me with frenzied exclamations that bespoke his soul felt joy. When I had finished, he cried out, "She were first to go. I thought so. I knew it. Where is she, captain? Oh, take me to her. I'll fall on my knees. I'll ax her 1,000 times to pardon me. 'Twar the Injun's fault. I'll swear it with the Chickasaw. She's been the cuss of us both. Oh, where's Marian? I love her more than ever. Where is she?" "Patience," I said. "You shall see her presently. She must be down the valley among the Indian women. Mount your horse and follow me." Chapter 82 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 82. Marigny. We had ridden around the butte, and were in the sight of the crowd of wailing women, when one on horseback was seen emerging from their midst, and turning head towards us. The habiliments of the rider told that she was a woman. I recognised the Navajo scarf and plumed circlet as those worn by the Wild Huntress. It was she who had separated from the crowd. Had I needed other evidence to identify her, I saw it in the wolf-like animal that was bounding after her, keeping pace with the gallop of her horse. "Behold," I said, "yonder is Marian, your own Marian." "It air, as I'm a living man. I mightn't a knowed her in that queer dress, but yon's her dog. It's Wolf. I could tell him anywhere." "On second thoughts," suggested I, "perhaps I had better see her first, and prepare her for meeting you. What say you?" "Just as you like, captain. Perhaps it mout be the better way." "Bide behind the waggon, then. Stay there till I give you a signal to come forth." Obedient to the injunction, my companion trotted back, and disappeared behind the white tilt. I saw the huntress was coming towards the mound, and instead of going forth to meet her, I remained upon the spot where we had halted. A few minutes sufficed to bring her near, and I was impressed more than ever with the grand beauty of this singular maiden. She was mounted in the Indian fashion, with a white goatskin for a saddle, and a simple thong for a stirrup; while the bold style in which she managed her horse told that, whatever had been her early training, she of late must have had sufficient practice in equestrian manoeuvres. The steed she bestrode was a large chestnut coloured mustang; and as the fiery creature reared and bounded over the surf, the magnificent form of its rider was displayed to advantage. She still carried her rifle, and was equipped just as I had seen her in the morning; but now, sharing the spirit of her steed, and further animated by the exciting incidents still in the act of occurrence, her countenance exhibited a style of beauty not the less charming from the wildness and bravery that characterised it. Truly she merited the praises which the young backwoodsman had oft lavished upon her. To all that he had said, the most critical connoisseur would have given his accord. No wonder that Wingrove had been able to resist the fascinations of the simpering sirens of Swampville. No wonder that Swanee had solicited in vain. Truly was this wild huntress an attractive object, in charms far excelling the goddess of the Ephesians. Never was there such mate for a hunter. Well might Wingrove rejoice at the prospect before him. "Ho, stranger!" she said, reining up by my side. "You are safe, I see. All has gone well?" "I was in no danger. I had no opportunity of entering into the fight." "So much the better. There were enough of them without you. But your fellow travellers, do they still survive? I have come to inquire after them." "Thanks to you and good fortune, they are still alive, even he who was scalped, and whom we had believed to be dead." "Ah! Is the scalped man living?" "Yes. He has been badly wounded, and otherwise ill used, but we have hopes for his recovery." "Take me to him. I have learnt a little surgery from my Indian friends. Let me see your comrade. Perhaps I may be of some service to him." "We have already dressed his wounds, and I believe nothing more can be done for him, except what time may accomplish. But I have another comrade who suffers from wounds of a different nature, which you alone can cure." "Wounds of a different nature?" repeated she, evidently puzzled by my ambiguous speech. "Of what nature, may I ask?" I paused before making reply. Whether she had any suspicion of a double meaning to my words, I could not tell. If so, it was not openly evinced, but most artfully concealed by the speech that followed. "During my stay among the Utahs," said she, "I have had an opportunity of seeing wounds of many kinds, and have observed their mode of treating them. Perhaps I may know how to do something for those of your comrade. But you say that I alone can cure them?" "You, and only you." "How is that, stranger? I do not understand you." "The wounds I speak of are not of the body." "Where then?" "In the heart." "Oh, stranger, you are speaking in riddles." "If your comrade is wounded in the heart, either by a bullet or an arrow, it is an arrow." "Then he must die. It will be impossible for any one to save him." "Not impossible for you. You can extract the arrow. You can save him." Mystified by the metaphor, for some moments she remained gazing at me in silence, her large antelope eyes interrogating me in the midst of her astonishment. So lovely were those eyes, that had their irids been blue instead of brown, I might have fancied they were Lilian's. In all but colour they looked exactly like hers, as I had once seen them. Spellbound by the resemblance, I gazed back into them without speaking, so earnestly and so long that she might easily have mistaken my meaning. Perhaps she did so, for her glance fell, and the circle of crimson suffusion upon her cheeks seemed slightly to extend its circumference. At the same time it turned deeper in hue. "Pardon me," said I, "for what may appear unmannerly. I was gazing at a resemblance." "A resemblance?" "Yes, one that recalls the sweetest hour of my life." "I remind you of some one, then?" "Ay, truly." "Some one who has been dear to you?" "Has been, and is." "Ah! And who, sir, may I have the fortune to resemble?" "One dear also to you your sister." "My sister?" "Lilian." End of chapter 82. Chapter 83 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 83. Old Memories Awakened. The rain dropped from her fingers. The rifle fell upon the neck of her horse, and she sat gazing at me in speechless surprise. At length, in a low murmur, as if mechanically, she repeated the words. "My sister Lillian?" "Yes, Marian Holt, your sister." "My name. How can you have become acquainted with it? You know my sister?" "Know her. I love her. I have given her my whole heart." "And has she returned your love?" Would that I could say surely yes. Alas, I am still in doubt. "Your words are strange. Oh, sir, tell me who you are. I need not question what you have said. I perceive that you know my sister, and who I am. It is true. I am Marian Holt. And you? You are from Tennessee?" "I have come direct from it." "From the Obion? Perhaps from your father's clearing on Mud Creek, Marian." "Oh, this is unexpected. What fortune to have met you, sir! Have you seen my sister, then?" "I have." "And spoken with her?" "How long ago?" "Scarcely a month." "So lately? And how looks she?" "She was well. How looks she?" "Beautiful Marian, like yourself. She was well, too, when I last saw her." "Dear Lillian! Oh, sir, how glad I am to hear from her. Beautiful, I know she is. Very, very beautiful." "Ah me! They said I was so too, but my good looks have been lost in the wilderness. A life like that I have been leading soon takes the softness from a girl's cheeks. But Lillian, oh stranger, tell me of her. I long to hear of her, to see her. It is but 6 months, and yet I think it 6 years since I saw her. Oh, how I long to throw my arms around her, to twine her beautiful golden hair around my fingers, to gaze into her blue, innocent eyes." My heart echoed the longings. Sweet little Lillian! Ah, little, perhaps not, sir. She will be grown by this, a woman like myself. "Almost a woman. Tell me, sir, did she speak of me? Oh, tell me what she said of her sister Marian." The question was put in a tone that betrayed anxiety. I did not leave her to the torture of suspense, but hastily repeated the affectionate expressions which Lillian had uttered in her behalf. Good, kind Lillian! I know she loves me as I love her. We had no other companions, none, I may say, for years, only father himself. And father, is he well?" There was a certain reservation in the tone of this interrogatory that contrasted strangely with that used when speaking of her sister. I well knew why. "Yes," I replied, "your father was also in good health when I saw him." There was a pause that promised embarrassment, a short interval of silence. A question occurred to me that ended it. "Is there no one else about whom you would desire to hear?" I looked into her eyes as I put the question. The colour upon her cheeks went and came, like the changing hues of the chameleon. Her bosom rose and fell in short convulsive breathings, and, despite an evident effort to stifle it, an audible sigh escaped her. The signs were sufficient. I needed no further confirmation of my belief. Within that breast was a souvenir that in interest far exceeded the memories of either sister or father. The crimson flush upon her cheek, the quick heaving of the chest, the half-hindered sigh, were evidences palpable and pronounced. Upon the heart of Marian Holt was the image of the handsome hunter, Frank Wingrove, graven there deeply and never to be effaced. "Why do you ask that question?" at length she inquired, in a voice of assumed calmness. "Know you anything of my history? You appear to know all. Has any one spoken of me?" "Yes, often. One who thinks only of you." "And who, may I ask, takes this single interest in a poor outcast maiden?" "Ask your own heart, Marian, or do you wish me to name him?" "Name him." "Frank Wingrove." She did not start. She must have expected that name, since there was no other to be mentioned. She did not start, though a sensible change was observable in the expression of her countenance. A slight darkening above her brow, accompanied by a pallor and compression of the lips, indicated pain. "Frank Wingrove," I repeated, seeing that she remained silent. "I know not why I should have challenged you to name him," she said, and still preserving the austere look. "Now that you have done so, I regret it. I had hoped never to hear his name again. In truth, I had well nigh forgotten it." I did not believe in the sincerity of the assertion. There was a slight tincture of pretence in the tone that belied the words. It was the lips alone that were speaking, and not the heart. It was fortunate that Wingrove was not within earshot. The speech would have slain him. "Ah, Marian!" I said appealingly, "he has not forgotten yours." "No. I suppose he mentions it with boasting." "Say rather with bewailing." "Bewailing, indeed! And why? That he did not succeed in betraying me?" "Far otherwise. He has been true to you." "It is false, sir. You know not, perhaps, that I was myself witness of his base treachery. I saw him. What you saw was a mere accidental circumstance, nor was it of his seeking. It was the fault of the Chickasaw, I can assure you." "Ha, ha! An accidental circumstance!" rejoined she, with a contemptuous laugh. "Truly a rare accident. It was guilt, sir. I saw him with his arms around her. With my own eyes I saw this. What farther proof need I of his perfidy?" "All that you saw, I admit; but more than saw it, I heard of his faithlessness. Did not she herself declare it in Swampville? Elsewhere? Boasted of it even to my own sister? More still, another was witness to his vile conduct had often seen him in her company. Ha! Little dreamed he, while dallying in the woods with his red-skinned squaw, that the earth has ears, and the trees have tongues. The deceiver did not think of that." "Fair Marian, they are foul calumnies; and whoever has given utterance to them did so to deceive you. Who, may I ask, was the other witness who has so misled you?" "Oh, it matters not now. Another villain like himself, one who oh God! I cannot tell you the horrid history. It is too black to be believed." "Nay, you may tell it me. I half know it already, but there are some points I wish explained. For your sake, for Wingrove's, for the sake of your sister." "My sister! How can it concern her? Surely it does not. Explain your meaning, sir." I endeavoured to avoid the look of earnest inquiry that was turned upon me. I was not yet prepared to enter upon the explanation. "Presently," I said, "you shall know all that has transpired since your departure from Tennessee. But first tell me of yourself. You have promised me? I ask it not from motives of idle curiosity. I have freely confessed to you my love for your sister Lilian. It is that which has brought me here. It is that which impels me to question you." "All this is mystery to me," replied the huntress, with a look of extreme bewilderment. "Indeed, sir, you appear to know all more than I; but in regard to myself, I believe you are disinterested, and I shall willingly answer any question you may think proper to ask me. Go on. I shall conceal nothing." "Thanks," said I. "I think I can promise that you shall have no reason to regret your confidence." Chapter 84 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 84. Playing Confessor. I was not without suspicion as to the motive of her complaisance. In fact, I understood it. Despite the declamatory denial she had given to its truth, my defence of Wingrove, I saw, had made an impression upon her. It had no doubt produced pleasant reflections, and rendered myself indirectly an object of gratitude. It was natural that such kindness should be reciprocated. My own intent in confessing the girl was twofold. First, on Wingrove's account, for notwithstanding all that had been said and done, her love for him might have passed. If so, instead of that happy reunion, two loving hearts, which I had anticipated bringing about, I should be the witness of a most painful interview. Without further delay, I entered upon the theme. My interrogatories were answered with candid freedom. The answers proved that what the Mexican had told me was true to the letter. "And did your father force you to this marriage?" The reply was given hesitatingly. It was in the affirmative. "He did." "For what reason did he so?" "I could never tell. The man had some power over him, but how, or in what way, I knew not then, nor do I now. My father told me it was a debt, a large sum which he owed him, and could not pay. I know not whether it was that. I hope it was." "You think then that Stebbins used some such means to force your father's consent?" "I am sure of it. My father told me as much. He said that by marrying Stebbins I could save him from disgrace, and entreated rather than forced me to it. You know, sir, I could not ask why. He was my father, I do think that it was not his wish that I should have that man, but something threatened him. Did your father know it was a false marriage? No, no, I can never think so. I am sure the villain deceived him in that, as he did me. Oh, father could never have done so. People, I believe, thought him wicked because he was short with them and used rough language, but he was not wicked. Something had crossed him, and he drank. He was at times unhappy, and perhaps ill-tempered with the world, but never with us. He was always kind to sister and myself, never scolded us. Ah, no, sir, I can never think he knew that. He was aware that Stebbins was a Mormon, was he not? I have tried to believe that he was not, though Stebbins afterward told me so. I well knew that he was aware of it, but said nothing. His saying so, continued she, proves nothing. If father did know of his being a Mormon, I am sure he was ignorant of the wickedness of these people. There were stories about them. There were others who contradicted these stories, and said they were all scandal. So little does the world know what is true from what is false. I learnt afterward that the very worst that was said of them was even less than the truth. Of course, you knew nothing of Stebbins being a Mormon? Oh, sir, how could I? There was nothing said of that. He pretended he was emigrating to Oregon, where a good many have gone. Had I known the truth, I should have drowned myself rather than have gone with him. After all, you would not have obeyed your father's will in the matter, had not something else arisen. At his solicitation you gave your consent, but were you not influenced by the incident that had occurred in the forest glade? Stranger, I have promised you I would conceal nothing, nor shall I. On discovering the falsehood of him who had told me he loved me, I was more than mad. I was revengeful. I will not deny that I felt spite. I scarcely cared what became of me, else how could I have consented to marry a man for whom I had neither love nor liking? On the contrary, I might almost say that I loathed him. And you loved the other? Speak the truth, Marian. You had promised to do so. You loved Frank Wingrove. I did. A deep drawn sigh followed the confession. Once more, speak the truth. You love him still? Oh, if he had been true, if he had been true! If true, could you love him still? Yes, yes, replied she, with an earnestness not to be mistaken. Love him then, Marian. Love him still. Frank Wingrove is true. I detailed the proofs of his loyalty from beginning to end. I had learnt every circumstance from Wingrove himself, and was able to set them forth with all the circumstantiality of truth itself. I spoke with as much earnestness as if I had been suing in my own cause, but I was listened to with willing ears, and my suit was successful. I even succeeded in explaining that sinister kiss that had been the cause of so much misfortune. End of chapter 84.